Namaste. I am delighted to host the very first talk on GHHRC's platform with very honorable Pandit Satish Sharma ji. GHHRC is a new platform. We are Global Hindu Human Rights Collective, and we are coming together. A lot of Hindu activists are coming together to take the movement of, or actually the crusade for the Hindu human rights across the globe. At this time, I have Pandit Satish Sharma ji, who has spent decades of his time in establishing a voice for the Hindus across the globe, and more so in UK, which is where he operates from, under the Global Hindu Federation organization. Satishi, it is an honor to host you today, to talk to you today, more so because this is my first initiative through GHHRC. You have been in this space for so long. You've been a voice for Hindu rights across UK for quite some time now. What is the Hindu human rights landscape looking for you at this time?
Firstly, Monicca, thank you so much for the chance to speak with you about these very important issues. And may I wish you every success with this platform. It is very much needed. In answer to your question, human rights are enshrined in international charters. And the assumption is that those human rights are inalienable, that nobody can take them away from you, and that you shouldn't need to have to defend them or demand them. That's the container within which this notion works. The reality is something quite different. And in fact, it's becoming clear that the United Nations and the human rights frameworks internationally were created to enable former colonial powers to scrutinize the former colonies and to explore them and to correct them and to fix them. Sadly, when we try to use our own circumstances and turn to these agencies and say, please protect our human rights, what we're finding is that they're not present, that they are not granting us that freedom to assume that we have human rights. We're having to fight for them. And it's an old proverb that if you have to fight for your human rights, then you never had them in the first place. So it's very, very important that we learn the language of these entities, these bodies and these charters, to be able to express our rights and to demand them now. I have been functioning in the human rights space for Hindus for a period of time, primarily in the United Kingdom, but recently in Europe and in the United States. And I have to say that unless we fight for our human rights, we're not going to be granted them, and they're not going to be respected. So this is the reality we face. So it's very, very timely that your organization is going to try and create that conversation.
So while the need for us to set up GHHRC came out of the lack of the presence of a voice in India for the Hindus, especially to protect their rights here. Globally, what do you think? Is there a voice that we have been able to raise in the forums, or for that matter, organizations like UN or the European Parliament that's standing up for us? What is the sense you have?
Not at all. In fact, I found quite a bit of duplicity. The European Parliament you've mentioned, the European Community, the European Union, they have been parading themselves as custodians of these rights. And yet when I scrutinize them, you probably wouldn't be aware of this, and I'm sure your viewers wouldn't be aware of it, but 24 nations, member nations, do not even recognize Sanatana Dharma as a state-accepted, legitimate religious tradition. So can you imagine that when a Hindu gets married in, shall we say, Belgium, they don't recognize a Hindu marriage under law as being a valid religious tradition. In the certificate of marriage, where it says religion, it says other. And so these are the people who have been the custodians of the human rights principles, and yet they've not applied it to themselves. Amnesty International, or as it's increasingly being called, Shamnesty International, they themselves have been self-proclaimed custodians on a global scale, and yet that when you raise with them the evidence that Hindus in their own indigenous homeland are actually existing under state-sanctioned religious apartheid, then they're the first to turn away and say, no, we're not going to get involved there. And we're finding this duplicity in pretty much every extra Bharatiya platform and forum where human rights are supposedly sacred.
Could it just be that, now let's look at the Jews, one of the most decimated group of people, because they have faced brutal violence across years, just as Hindus have. But then the Jews have been able to collectively stand up for their rights, right? And recognize the fact that there are countries and there are people who have acted against them. But then for the Hindus, sadly, neither is there that protection nor the acceptance of the fact that we probably are the only race where over 1 billion Hindus over years have got massacred, and the longest genocides have been faced by our own people. But then, do you think that even the Indian government would acknowledge this, or has acknowledged it and done enough? What's the external view that you have into the Hindu human rights activity that's taking place within India?
We have a huge problem. You mentioned the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
The reason they wanted a state is because a nation state can act laws. A nation state can enact laws for the protection of its own people.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only purpose of having statehood. And that's why Israel as a nation is so vital to them. Here in Bharat, the Hindus, the indigenous people of this particular land, who have been here for thousands of years, do not have a state which is enacting legislation for their protection. So we are actually worse off than the Jewish people. We have not had a judiciary or a penal system, a civil code, which is primarily to protect the indigenous civilization. So we have a long way to go. And this needs to be addressed. I've been trying to see how, internally from within Bharat, this could be dealt with and addressed. I have to say, I don't see a path whereby the indigenous voice can actually have an indigenous legal system to protect itself. I can't see how that can happen. I think it's really important for us to appeal to higher authorities and much larger platforms. I would suggest, and we're working towards this, that we need a Hindu civilizational voice at the United Nations. We have a national Indian voice at the United Nations, but it's not a civilizational voice. It is a state voice, and it cannot express the interests and wishes of the indigenous people as a priority. So that has to be rectified, and the same applies to other international platforms. I think an external voice would be able to talk to the Indian state and require it not to apply apartheid type legislation to its own indigenous people.
True. I mean, in India, I'm sure you're aware of this, that the Hindu temples, now a temple in India for a Hindu is his soul. The reason being that for this nation, the binding factor across the several thousands of years has been that space called a temple that was our cultural center. And today that itself has been taken over by the government. So whatever monies that the Hindus with faith put in a temple are used by the government, taken away by the government to fund activities of other religions under a fund which is called, like, to give you an example, that I operate from Telangana, and this state has an endowments fund. So what it does is it goes to the Hindu temples, it sets up a collection point there, it picks up the monies, it brings the monies into its coffers, and then it has set up what is known as a common good fund. And through the common good fund, the monies are spent on, up till now, there were trips for the Christians to Bethlehem, the Hajj subsidy for the Muslims, making it really comfortable for them to go to their own holy places and come back. Whereas for Hindus, if you have to travel to your holy place, you en route, you're paying several taxes to be able to go to to visit your holy places. So in India, while there is this apartheid kind of a situation against its own people, something that I think the government itself has been very, very responsible for, because corrections can only happen constitutionally or judicially. And both of these state actors have failed the Hindus, especially in India. In UK, very recently, there were the Leicester riots that took place. What has been your observation on how the government viewed the riots? Because Hindus were, innocent victims there. But it did so happen that through your own BBC, the documentary that you made, and congratulations and kudos to you for bringing BBC to in front of people and exposing BBC's agenda in front of people, but to blame the riots back onto the Hindus as a propaganda. How do the Hindus in UK view this discrimination, I would call it?
So there are several strands to the questions, and I'll deal with them one
Sure.
by one. Firstly was the reference to the temples and the occupation and plundering of Hindu religious institutions to serve other religious traditions. That's slavery. The definition of slavery is that you work and somebody else benefits, that you do not have the freedom to control the products of your labor, the fruits of your labor, somebody else is deriving that benefit. That is slavery. And so Hindus are enslaved by the institutions which run this particular, the HN, Hindu Mandir's Endowment Board or something.
Yeah, it's called the endowments. Yeah.
So let me clearly state that this is persecution in terms of the human rights definitions. It is slavery. And that is unacceptable. So if you understand that as being the essence of what's being done, the Bharatiya state is actually enslaving the indigenous people of this land, and the fruits of their hard labor is actually being directed towards ideologies which have a history of persecution in this land.
Yes.
That is how I would state the situation we're in. If you can imagine us being in the United Kingdom and the British government taxing British churches to support the proliferation of Hindu mandirs, it's a nonsense. It's a madness.
Unthinkable.
And it would be recognized as such. And the same applies to any other country. You can't imagine. We have a mandir in Bahrain, in the United Arab Emirates. You can't imagine the masjids being taxed and the benefits of the contributions, the zakat and everything else being directed towards the maintenance of the Hindu community. It's madness, and yet it's law in this country. That needs to be rectified, and I think the sooner the government recognises it, the better for all of us. Turning to Leicester, we relied on the fact that we are equal citizens. Not so much that we're Hindus, but that we're equal citizens like all other citizens who pay taxes. And so we would have the protection of the law, that we would be dealt with on the basis of equality. And yet, that didn't happen. In Leicester, we clearly saw that our rights as British citizens were actually just a figment of our imagination. You will have seen the pictures of police standing by whilst Muslim youngsters were burning Hindu flags. Okay? And that is incitement. It is a breach of every public order criminal law, and yet they didn't protect us and they didn't protect our institutions. Only a week or two ago, an English lady was imprisoned for 2.5 years for a social media post. Now, which of the two is a greater incitement? So there's an inequality there, a biased application of law and justice. And so I'm afraid it's the same. Turning to your other point, Hindus are finding this everywhere. In California, we saw it with their attempts to introduce, on the basis of no evidence, just malice and rumour, something equivalent to the SCSTF. And we were successful in defeating it. In Canada, we're seeing Hindu mandirs being attacked, and yet the state is not coming out in force to say, no, freedom of religion must be defended. Not in the case of Hindus. So this is not just a localized phenomenon, it's much deeper. and much wider phenomenon across the globe. And I think we need to have the voice of Hindus on the global platform in order to be able to protect our rights very, very soon. And I would say that we have to bring the Bharatiya state to recognize that it's denying Hindus their inalienable human rights as per the United Nations charters. And they have an obligation, and they're not fulfilling that obligation.
They are not just for the Hindus within the state, Panditji, but also very recently the genocidal, the fervor with which Hindus were attacked in Bangladesh. The Indian government failed to raise a voice in time, even for the Hindus across. Now we can always say that that's something that's going on across the borders in a different country, and we as a a sovereign state, or they as a sovereign state, cannot have a neighboring state interfere in their activities. But then there are Hindus who are being persecuted, who are being killed, their daughters, the women, snatched away in front of their families, raped in front of the parents, and our government stays quiet. Do you think there is a higher role that the Indian government needs to play to raise a voice for the Hindus while it continues to hold itself on the secular grounds?
This is at the heart of all of the problems that the indigenous communities of Bharat face, especially what's called the majority. For some reason, we have adopted the understanding that being a majority is a bad thing, and that's utter nonsense. In the West, it was a problem because the Abrahamic traditions have a habit and a history whereby they have persecuted minorities. The Roman Catholic Church was established on the Code of Theodosius, which wiped out minorities right across the Roman Empire. Literally, genocide was inflicted. And so in the West, there is a history of minorities needing protection. Here in Bharat, we have never had minorities being persecuted. And so the allegation is false. It's not supported by history or evidence. And yet somehow reason we bought into the idea that Hindus as a majority is a bad thing. And the government sadly perpetuates it. It needs to decolonize itself. It needs to recognize that minorities are not necessarily always vulnerable. There is such a thing as a toxic minority. We are seeing the impact of toxic minorities in terms of what's happening in Canada. The Khalistani elements there are becoming extremist day by day, and suddenly we're all discovering that they are heavily involved in criminal activities. It's an example of a toxic minority. So toxic minorities do exist, and beneficial majorities do exist. Why are we handcuffing ourselves with the idea that just because Hindus are a majority, then potentially they're toxic, and that as a majority they need to be constrained and the minorities protected? Bharat has a history of beneficial minorities such as the Parsis and the Jews,
the Tibetans,
the Jains, the Tibetans. They're all wonderful minorities, and none of them are complaining that the Bharatiya state, that the Bharatiya civilization, that the Bharatiya people is oppressing them. And yet there is one minority, allegedly, a very large, I think it was called the second largest
second largest majority,
trumpeting to the world that they are endangered, but there is no evidence that they are. There is ample evidence that the majority is endangered. Why doesn't the government speak up on behalf of the indigenous population? I'm struggling to understand why. I'm still waiting for a statement expressing remorse at what happened to the Balgar Sadhus, and it hasn't come out yet. Why not? They're citizens. The intention of a secular state is that it doesn't view the identity parameters on a religious base of any of its citizens. And so the Balgar Sadhus are eligible for the protection of the law like any other citizen of this country. And yet there is discrimination in terms of offering that protection. This is the clarity with which we need to start to engage with all of our states around the world. Bharat needs to be the source of protecting the indigenous values of our civilization. If it's not, then there isn't one in the world. There are 57 nations which are state committed to protecting the Christian tradition. Sorry,
the Muslim, yes.
There are over 117 committed to protecting the Christian tradition. There is only one which is openly saying that we are a Hindu state, and that's Nepal. Why isn't it Bharat?
Right.
It has to be Bharat. The other thing I'd like to say is I don't think the Indian government can have it both ways. It cannot go out to the diaspora and represent itself as the custodian of the Hindu civilization, whilst discriminating and oppressing the Hindus of its own homeland. This is a problem. I know that if I were to move into Bharat, or my children were to want to live in this country, they would automatically face discrimination on the basis of some notion of ancestral guilt, which is not a legal principle, or group guilt, which is not a legal principle. They would not have committed any crimes to warrant discrimination, and yet they would be on the receiving end of discrimination. And so why on earth would people outside of this nation sacrifice their human rights to serve the civilization? It's a dharma sankat for us, and the state needs to resolve this issue.
What do you think is fueling the sudden rise of Hindu phobia across the world? Do you think this is being fed from within India, or it has its roots in some sublime propaganda that's going on across the world?
According to our dharmic principles, everybody is born dharmic. The very fact of manifesting in form is an act of dharma. The whole of the Brahmand has conspired to create and bring into manifestation a human being.
Mm-hmm.
And so our point of view is that everybody is born dharmic. But the trouble is you cannot rule people unless you can divide them and create conflict. And so there are people who have acquired wealth, power, status, influence by dividing and rule for hundreds of years. And they have managed to convince many generations that they have a valid point of view. They are fearful of the dharmic perspective, which says that, for example, females are equally divine as males. Outside of Bharat, that's not a principle that is widely recognized.
Not at all.
Can you imagine what would happen if that became common knowledge? That we say that the fundamental rule of equality is that females and males are equally divine. Let them just stomach the consequences of that and their power structures, their hegemony, which has been built on these dharmic principles, suddenly start to crack. They are very aware that our philosophies and the things that have sustained our civilization across millennia represent a threat to their hegemony. They want us for our contribution to Artha for them. They want us to provide to become the doctors to look after their populations. But the moment we get to a position where we are influencing either the political life of a country or the religious life of a country, all of a sudden we are found to be under scrutiny. And every flaw imaginable, including imagined flaws, suddenly start to be aired. And we end up in a situation where we're defending ourselves. Whereas if we were able to rely on our human rights, we wouldn't even need to be defending ourselves, because those people would be saying, no, they're our citizens, and they're also worthy of protection. That's all evaporated. So we're now finding that to be happening across the globe. And it will increase. It will increase because the hegemony does not value the ideologies and the perspective that we have, which are ultimately human rights are enshrined in dharmic principles. There is no dharmic principle which is contrary to human rights. We have a bigger vision. We also include not just human rights, we include the rights of all jiva. We include the rights and elevate the rights of Bhudevi even higher than those of jiva. And so we have a much broader perspective of what rights are applicable. And those rights work contrarily to the shallow, small framework of human rights which they have created to protect themselves.
What is it that you think we need to do differently to raise awareness of the fact that the Hindu Dharma is good for the world, because it's all encompassing? It talks of equality, it talks of peace, it talks of coexistence, and probably the only Dharma, I mean, for want of a better word, the only religion in the world that treats women as equal to men. so when we have everything that's so good that we are able to offer to the world, whether it is our Ayurveda, whether it is yoga, whether it is meditation, whether it is just philosophy of life, we haven't really been able to bring in acceptance of our civilization as a knowledgeable civilization that's able to contribute to making the world a better place. Somewhere, I think that we're not able to project the strengths of our people, our civilization, our dharma. What are some things that we can do whereby we are able to protect not just what we can bring to the world, but also our rights as Hindus?
It's a wonderful question. And the number of times I'm asked, Anthony, what do we do next? If I could have a penny for every time, I'd be incredibly wealthy. It's the contemporary issue at this moment in time. There are two things that we need to do. One is Hindus need to realize what it is to be a Hindu. I've worked with many people who are not born in this tradition, but they have made the journey from being Christians or being Muslims. They have compared their ideologies to what it is to be a Sanatani. And they have made the journey. They have sacrificed their community ties in pursuit of Satya, in pursuit of inner harmony. So they are committed Hindus. They have become fully incarnate Hindus. But here in Bharat, we have a lot of people who are accidental Hindus. They're born into a tradition, but they don't really know. And what we need now is for them to step forward and fully embody the principles of what it is to be a Hindu. When that happens, we will see a great cohesiveness appearing in this land. We will be able to, from a very solid understanding of who we are, talk to every other ideology, the children of all other perspectives, and say this is who we are. At the moment, we haven't done that. I remember Swami Chinmayanandaji, he said the first thing we have to do is convert Hindus to Hinduism.
To Hinduism.
Right? So this is number one. And if we haven't made that journey ourselves, it's hypocrisy for us to preach it to other people. So we have to get a huge number of Hindus to make that journey and discover what it is that our ancestors have bequeathed to us. It's unique and it's powerful. That's number one. The second thing we must do is we must have our voice on the international stage of human rights. There is no Hindu voice at the United Nations. There are Indian voices. There are voices talking about education. But there is no voice which says, I am a voice of the Sanatani tradition. That has to change. And we're working on that. We're hoping in a very short time we will see the appearance of a Sanatani voice at the highest levels of the United Nations, talking to the voices of Islam, the voices of Christianity, of Buddhism and others. They do have voices, we don't. When that voice appears there, we can contribute of our wisdom and of our understanding, of our darshans at that level. So both need to.
Yes, this is a long way to go. I thank you, Panditji, for taking time and sharing your views. We will be in touch. We will seek your counsel, and I look forward to working with you to see that Hindus are safer across the world. We are more accepted for the goodness that we bring to this world. We do not deserve to be treated against for any reason, and our rights as Hindus are acknowledged, accepted, and protected by all across the world. On behalf of GHHRC, I sign off, but I request you all to stay in touch with us. Call us at 99516-70004 wherever you find a Hindu's human right violated. We're there for you. We're there to raise your voice. We're there to raise a voice in support of the Hindus' right to their life. Thank you. Namaste.